You're listening to iCannabisRadio.com.
Welcome to In the Lab with Jennifer. I am Jill, and Jennifer is in Tahoe. So I'm going to be doing the show today, and my guest is Nick Heiss, and we'll hear from him in just a minute. It is a 420 week here in Denver, which is very exciting and very busy. There is more going on than there are hours in the day. I also wanted to mention that if you hadn't heard, there was two tragic bombings in Boston, so that is very sad, and we don't exactly know what's going on there yet. We were going to have Rob Hunt from the Coalition for Responsible Patient Care out in Massachusetts join us, but I think we are going to have to bring him on another time as he deals with that tragedy. But so this week, 420 week, I'm going to be at the Cup, and we are going to be broadcasting live 4 to 6 on Saturday. So hope you'll tune in, or if you are at the Cup, stop by and talk to us. We would love to see you. I'm sure it's going to be tons of fun. And then there's just events all weekend. There's so much music going on. I'm hoping to go to Ozomotley. But Nick, what are you doing this week?
I will be trying to get out to the Cup as much as possible. I'll be busy around the cultivation facility, but Saturday afternoon I am going to try to make it out to the Cup. I'll definitely be at the Cup on Sunday. We are entering one of our strains, R18 or OG18, into the Cup. So also probably be involved in our Green Team event that's happening down at Civic Center Park on Saturday. Basically, we go out there with a volunteer team and set up a booth and hand out trash bags, and we have a bunch of volunteers also that are involved with us, several other shops, Pink House, Verde, Local Product. There's really too many to name almost. A couple other local businesses that are involved in the industry that are helping, donating prizes, donating money, and really just helping getting volunteers out to help show that we are responsible individuals in our community as well, and we can help pick up trash and keep the community clean, because that's an important thing to us.
I actually did, and Nick's with Denver Relief. I'm not sure if we actually said that, but Denver Relief every year does the Green Team, which is great, and gets a lot of good press for the dispensary patient industry model. And I did do it one year. It's tons of fun. You meet so many interesting people, and generally the trash is not too bad, but I would say avoid areas with strollers in them. Yeah, from personal experience.
Lots of times participants at the park are more than willing to hand their trash to you as you walk by. There are so many people there, as you know, and it gets bigger every year, that it's really not that dirty of a job. You know, lots of times we have gloves on, and you can just simply walk around and open up your trash bag, and people are more than kind enough to donate to the trash bag.
Yeah, they are. It is lots of fun. And it is going to be huge this year, I'm sure. And I actually read an article, had Miguel Lopez and a few other people talking about it, but they're interviewing the guy from Denver's basically Convention and Visitors Bureau, and he's like, I just don't, the article said they chronically overestimate their crowds every year. I thought that was kind of funny. But he's like, I just don't think it's going to bring in that many people. But, I mean, the Cannabis Cup tickets, I think, on StubHub are like $1,000. Which I think is insane. But I know they're way sold out. Nobody can get tickets now. So I hope everybody has their tickets.
Exactly.
But if you work and volunteer, so if you're interested in volunteering, actually email Jennifer, Genifer at canlabs.com, because there's so many different opportunities to volunteer for great causes, and people are looking for help because not lots of people want to actually work that weekend. It'll be the first year that I'm not in the dispensaries, and then I'm actually down at the Cup, so it should be crazy. Fun.
Yeah, a nice change of pace for you, I'm sure.
Yeah. Maybe a little too crowded. That was my thing with, Green Team, is it got to be a little bit too crowded for me. Like, I do not like those crowds, and it's going to be insane.
It does get pretty insane. Fortunately, this year we have more volunteers helping out than we've ever had in the past, so it's really exciting. It should be a good time.
And free food. Yay.
Free food, yes.
Yay, free food. Explain how the entering works and the judging. And, like, did you enter stuff last year?
We actually skipped last year. We didn't enter anything last year.
How about the year before that?
The year before that, we did enter biodiesel.
So is it different this year because of medical versus recreational? And, like, who are the judges and how is all that working? Because they used to, if you were entering, I believe you brought it to a dispensary. They essentially purchased it wholesale somehow. I don't know how they got around that. But then the patient would come in, buy the product, and take it home. And the thing that I found interesting, if you watch that, one of those horrible Discovery Channel or reality shows, and it showed the girl, Miss High Times, Brittany, testing, and she's just pulling bong after bong of stuff. And I was always like, how can you have any good evaluation after, like, 3 pulls? Like, does that bother you?
That's a very good question. I know they have changed the judging up a little bit because they do want to have it. They want the competition to be legitimized. There has been some talk in the past about, how this judging process works. I had one of my partners actually drop off the sample, so as far as the purchasing from the judges and how that works out, I'm not exactly sure. But I can tell you that we dropped off our product last week, I believe last Tuesday. So there has been, a little bit, a week and a half basically for the judges to test all the product, which is still a relatively short period of time. But again, it is better than some of these competitions where they have, 48 hours to test all of these products. And I can also tell you that this year they are doing it a little bit different with the recreational side as well. There actually are 2 cups this year. There's going to be the recreational cup and then there's the medical marijuana cup. It's my understanding that they're going to be separated physically as well to a certain extent. I think the recreational cup might be held across the street. I'm pretty sure that they leased another lot across the way to sort of be able to physically separate the medical cup from the recreational cup. But there will be 2 cups this year, so that should be interesting. The recreational cup, of course, if you're 21 or older and have product on hand, then you were allowed to enter that cup. So I'm not quite sure if out-of-state people have had the opportunity to enter that cup, but I'm sure there are quite a few recreational growers here in the state now that are able to do that.
Yeah, but I wonder if legally you could have had a harvest by the time the law passed. And the other thing they never talk about, and actually I saw this in the news today too, I think someone in Nevada brought it up, is when they implemented like 1284 or they implement medical marijuana legislation or Washington's legislation, it was illegal prior to then to have plants or seed. And they can't cross state lines, so where are these supposed to be coming from? And it's just that big unknown, everybody knows, but nobody talks about secret, and they just kind of let it happen. I just find that fascinating, too, that it's just...
Sure.
It would be so nice if we had a good seed bank and we could cross state lines with seeds. That would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know right now in Colorado here, they require us, the only way we are allowed to sell seeds from our retail centers is if we actually produce them in our own facilities, which does put quite a limitation on that because, of course, lots of us are trying to grow seedless marijuana or sinsemilla, right. And the last thing we want to do is have breeding programs in the room right next door.
And it really is a shame because there were people and are people now who would love to start genetics companies, and it is like the licensing doesn't work. And so you have to fit all of these great, unique business ideas into like a dispensary, a edibles manufacturer, or a grower who has to be tied to the dispensary. Like you cannot have... just kind of testing production grows, so it's really a shame.
It really is, and we, for example, have popped a lot of seeds in the past and tried to, find new genetics, better genetics, and things like that. But it really is limiting because we've got to immediately take those into our plant count equation, which if anyone's, propagated from seed before, they know it's a much longer process. You got to weed out the males from the females. You could be looking at a year to 2 years easily before you find a phenotype that's worth keeping. And all along the way, of course, the more seeds you pop, the more variety you have and the better selection that you have to choose from to try to get that good phenotype or that good genetic in your building. But again, at the same time, we have to label and document all of those plants back to our computer software. And that's a big risk for us to take, and it's a financial it limits us financially in the amount of product that we can produce and send down to the retail center. So it's tough. It limits us.
Yeah, I mean, it does, and it's a shame, but I'm sure we'll all continue to figure out how to get seeds and plants.
Yeah, and I think the politicians, as they're regulating and going through this regulatory process in all of these states, I think they're well aware of the gray market and or black market that already exists, and they know, like we do, that these plants do exist. They're in every state in the country, and they've realized now, a lot of them, that the better route is to tax and regulate it and to try to set up these regulatory frameworks, and, good for them. But yeah, until that time, the plants just have magically appeared in a lot of these states, I guess you could say.
They are magic, some of them, for sure. So, but it is, that's one of those things about regulation and starting to move to a legal recreational market is no one's ever done this before, and there are going to be mistakes, and it's just fascinating to watch, and I think we're all very, very lucky to be here now, and like, when we talk to our grandkids, what we'll tell them, like, it was such a mess and there were all these regulations. And I'm actually kind of surprised reading Connecticut. And what I really wanted to talk about today is pesticides because it fascinates me. And what brought it up was a story in Maine where a cultivation facility, they had some, I guess, not happy employees who called and reported them for using pesticides, which were banned by the regulation. And that was something that Colorado didn't even fathom touching, and I think maybe this is the difference between, Colorado did a process with this big stakeholder group. They had plenty of growers at the table. They had plenty of doctors. They had law enforcement. It was a big mess, and it took forever, but it came out with the only banned substances in grows were EPA banned chemicals. Mm-hmm. Anything else you could use in their thought processes, there's nothing legally made for this product, and so it's kind of buyer beware. And what they ended up saying is you have to disclose everything you apply to your crop, and they left it at that. But when I read that Maine banned all pesticides, I was like, wow, that's kind of extreme. And so we've seen Connecticut mirror it, and we've seen Massachusetts mirror it. And I know you've looked at the Massachusetts regs, so, it's kind of contradictory. It's actually, it says that all pesticide use is banned, but then it also says you have to follow USDA organic standards, which we'll talk about the conflict there because USDA organic standards allows you to use pesticides.
Absolutely.
But I wanted to kind of back up a couple steps and first talk about how do you feel? Well, let's talk about your background because you come from plant husbandry, but not marijuana plant husbandry, greenhouse growing,
Greenhouse
correct?
nursery background, mostly like ornamental shade trees, evergreen trees, shrubs, things of that nature.
So what I'm curious about is how, in that background, did you deal much with USDA organic? Probably not because you're not eating many shrubs, but on food, do you think it's reasonable to even apply that to marijuana? Like, is it written
Not really. I did deal a little bit with USDA organic standards right before I moved out to Colorado, actually. We were getting ready to put quite a few acres into blueberry, blackberry production and also hop production we were sort of expanding into. I was an avid home brewer at the time, and the hop prices had spiked because of a massive warehouse fire up in Washington State at the time where most of them are being produced.
Oh, really? Are most hops being produced indoors?
No, outdoors. But the processing equipment is so expensive to process the hops that most of the farms ship them to one warehouse to get them all processed and packaged. And at the end of the season, when all of the basically growers had sent them to this warehouse, the warehouse burnt down. So a majority of the product in the state was in that warehouse, unfortunately. But again, with the USDA Organic, we were trying to get a grant to grow some of these blueberries and the hops and things like that. This was right at the beginning of Obama's first administration, I believe, when they were trying to really help the economy out, and they were giving out a lot of these grants. And the grant just didn't end up being enough money to justify the extra production that we had to do. But the USDA organic standards or requirements are much easier to live by when you are growing an agricultural commodity outdoors, because at that point you can use more beneficial insects and things like that, or in a greenhouse setting even. But to put in there explicitly, as they do in Section 105 for Massachusetts anyway, Section 4, they put in there explicitly, application of any pesticide in the cultivation of marijuana is prohibited, period. And as we talked about earlier, a pesticide can be anything that a grower is using to try to get rid of a pest. If you sprinkle salt around the edge of your grow room as a desiccant to try to, deter insects from coming in, to try to dehydrate them as they're coming in the room, technically that's a pesticide. And if these regulations as they're written now stand, no application of any pesticides, period, then that's pretty impossible for any grower to adhere to. With that being said, right after that it says all cultivation must adhere to U.S. Department of Ag organic requirements. And I think that's more likely going to be the case. And if that's the case, then that is something that all growers can live with. It does limit a lot of the synthetic pesticides that you can use. But at the same time, if you're doing other things, if you have biological controls in place, if you have mechanical controls in place, having an integrated pest management program or an IPM program in place really is important at that point, because as we all know as growers, the earlier you find the pest or disease, the easier it is to control before the population's outbreak.
Sounds good. We're actually going to go ahead and take a break and come right back to this.
Blue Sage Microbes unveils the ultimate in superior soil, Ideal Soil, a 16-quart bag of the best growing soil ever engineered. Superior plant health and vitality is a direct result of the structure and chemistry of your soil. How good is your growing soil? Is your growing soil really balanced? How do you know? Well, Blue Sage Microbes has a newly designed growing soil that is the most advanced growing medium ever offered for cannabis cultivation. This is the only brand in the marketplace that provides growers with an ideal soil structure designed to work specifically with their cultivation systems. You will have your best grow results ever. Call now for a special introductory offer, 888-959-8551, or log on to bluesagemicrobes.com and experience a new level in growing. That's 888-959-8551.
Call Canisher at 1-800-420-5757 for all your insurance needs. Canisher understands the risks you face each day, and we are there to protect your business and your investment. Since 2010, Canisher has been serving the cannabis industry nationwide. Call Canisher at 1-800-420-5757 or visit us on the web at canisher.com to learn more about our insurance and risk management services. Proud member of the NCIA.
Tired of dispensary hopping? Trying to find quality meds? Look no further and get to know Greenworks. Our shops are stocked with over 20 strains of organically grown meds, including R4, the highest tested CBD strain in Colorado. Yes, we back up our quality with testing. While Greenworks offers only the highest quality meds, we don't believe in high prices, with eighths ranging from $20 to $40 and ounces capped at $175. With 2 centers in Denver and 1 in Glenwood Springs, we're likely closer than you think. Call 303-647-5210 to find the location nearest you.
All right, and back to bugs. I actually pulled up the definition of pesticide, and it is any substance or mixture of substances intended for preventing, destroying, repelling, or mitigating any pest. And then it also has a few other things, including any substance intended for use as a plant regulator, defoliant, or desiccant, and any nitrogen stabilizer. So to me, it's one thing to ban the use of toxic pesticides or unhealthy pesticides, but you need to be able to keep bugs off your crop. And so this definition's huge, and it, like you said, includes almost anything like sticky traps, ant traps around the grow. What's a plant regulator?
It really doesn't apply to our industry, but a plant regulator, lots of these ornamental crops, let's say like a burning bush shrub that a landscaper might use to plant around your house. Lots of times they actually want to regulate the growth in those plants and keep them from growing so large that they're so that rather than replacing your landscape every 12 to 15 years because the shrubs got so big, if they can put growth regulators on them.
Oh yeah, we don't want to keep our plants from growing.
they can keep them at a smaller size so that, in big commercial facilities and things like that, instead of having to redo the landscaping every so often, you can just keep the same shrub in there for 20 or 30 years without it cracking the foundation or growing into your building, knocking out windows, stuff like that.
And then nitrogen stabilizer. Is that something we use?
No. Well, actually, if I'm understanding that correctly, some growers use fertigation systems or injection systems where they actually put concentrated nutrients into one reservoir or container, and as the irrigation system turns on and feeds the crop, it actually mixes the nutrients in line as it's feeding. So the nitrogen stabilizer would be a synthetic that they're putting in there to help keep the nitrogen happy. It can be very flammable and explosive as well. So to keep things like that from happening, it's important to put stabilizers in it.
That's interesting. But let's ignore the fact that they banned all pesticides altogether and that they've done this in a couple states and might continue to do so. And so that's why I'm so interested in it from a policy standpoint. But the USDA organic standards, and it's generally, those were written for food primarily. And one of the interesting things about our crop is that, when it comes to nutrients and pesticides and the other products we use, they're not labeled for this crop. And so when you talk about, instead of maybe banning pesticides altogether and banning certain ones, the only other comparable crop we have, and I do want you to talk about how hops and marijuana are similar, because that's a comparable crop, I think, in the way it's grown or the nutrients it uses or something like that, but we don't smoke anything other than tobacco. And so when you look at the list of pesticides that are allowed for tobacco, they're pretty gnarly.
They are. And like you said, it's a whole new world here. We are sort of pioneers in what we're doing, so it is hard to apply a lot of these regulations to cannabis because lots of times we are inhaling the cannabis. So it is important, I think, for somebody to do some more research on some of these synthetic pesticides. I personally think that your best bet as a grower is to try to stay with those organic standards and try to use as much organic product as possible. And again, go back to your integrated pest management program and really have a program set in place where you are doing the same thing every week, documenting and recording any findings that you have, and find the bugs at ground zero, find the pests at ground zero, find them when they're at a low enough population that you can either quarantine plants, toss plants out, and or use some mild organic things on them. For example, beneficial biologics. You can use, ladybugs will eat aphids. There are different predatory wasps and things like that. These, for us in the indoor grow environment under artificial light, the beneficial biological predators aren't always the best bet because lots of times we put ladybugs in the room and they fly up to the high intensity lights, and next thing you know, they're crispy critters and they die off before the bad guys do.
Have the labor to take them down and clean them out. And
so depending on how strict they are with some of these regulations on the East Coast, I would definitely consider greenhouse production there, because they have not, as long as your security is in place, you are allowed, it's my understanding, you're allowed to use greenhouse cultivation in a lot of these states. And I think as this industry grows, that's something that we as growers really need to take into consideration, is greenhouse production. Because if we are in greenhouse production, obviously biological control becomes much more of an option for us. We might have supplemental lights in the greenhouse, but they're not going to be on all the time. And per square footage, they're not going to be as intense. So you can be more effective with the biological controls.
Well, and I think with the regulations for 64, they're open to greenhouse growing, and we should start seeing a lot more of it here, which is beneficial because it's easier, less costly, reduces price, reduces energy usage.
There are definitely a lot of pros to greenhouse production, and there are a lot of shops in town that are currently turning over towards greenhouse production, or in the process of having greenhouses built because of the benefits. At the same time, with the OMRI or the Organic Materials Review Institute, there are a lot of very good organic products out there that are OMRI certified. One thing that we use very commonly is neem as sort of a preventative in vegetation. And when we're talking about cannabis, I think it's really important to talk about vegetation when we're putting on any kind of pesticide, whether it's organic, whatever it is. We personally do not put anything on in our flower rooms. Most of our plants are on a 70-day flower cycle, but with that being said, anything that goes into flower, it's riding out those 70 days. If it's got something on it, then we let it be and we let it ride and get what we can out of it. But at the same time, if you've got a good IPM program and you're really on top of your game and paying attention daily to what's going on in your facilities, you shouldn't have such a big population outbreak to where it cripples your production. But again, back to the neem, it comes from neem tree out of India. There's also a more concentrated oil called azadirachtin that also comes from the neem tree. These are both very good preventatives, and they're controls. If you have a huge population outbreak in your facility, it's not going to wipe it out like synthetics do, and that goes for most of the other controls. There's something out there called Bavaria bassiana, which is a natural fungus that is very good at eating basically a lot of critters, aphids, white flies, lots of good stuff like that. But again, these controls, these organic controls, if you're working on low populations of pests or disease pressure, then they're going to work pretty good for you. But if you get to the point where you're getting overrun with bugs, lots of these are sort of more preventative measures and controls, but they're not going to eradicate. That's where synthetics come into play. So if we're doing a good job as growers and staying on top of these bugs and disease pressures in the vegetation area, then we should be able to get away with most of these OMRI-listed organic materials. And again, quarantining plants or just tossing plants out when you do find ground zero.
Well, what would you say, for a home grower who's not in a commercial environment, is it easier or more difficult to maintain a healthy environment not using chemicals, whether synthetic or organic?
It should be easier, unless you're in an apartment complex where every other person in the building is also a grower, and they're not doing very good integrated pest management. It should be relatively easy. You should be able to, look at all your plants relatively quickly and see if you have a problem. Remove any plants that look like they are a problem child. Usually once a plant gets heavily infested, whether it's disease pressure or bug pressure, it's not going to bounce back. Even if you try to push it through flower, it's not going to have the same yield or same productivity. The quality of the product is going to be degraded. So lots of times when we find healthy plants in a vegetation room, it's oftentimes best to just toss them out, cut them down, mix them with post-consumer waste, and throw them out in the trash.
Yeah, I wonder what the regulations are going to come out with for trash. I don't know that they brought that up as one of the big points in the 64 discussions, but reading like Connecticut and Maine and Massachusetts, like Connecticut, you have to drop off waste byproduct to a drug drop-off point at like a police station or a pharmacy, which is funny.
They're going to find that to be a big pain
I think
very
they'll figure
quickly.
that out. But then in Massachusetts, dispensaries are required to act as like waste holding treatment, and then they don't treat it, but they have to hold it, and then they deliver it to the enforcement division that burns it, which I thought was kind of cool. That's like returning your oil to the car parts store. So, but it would, I think, increase break-in risk too, because dumpsters, are you in Denver? Like dumpster diving is great.
Three times a week at least, probably. And we have a locked and padlocked dumpster, and
yep.
it gets broken off all the time. Lots of times too, the plastic flap actually, the padlock actually locks. They just take knives and things like that and cut the plastic, so the padlock's still there, the lock's still on
It'll just jump on it.
But the plastic's ripped off the top. The way we're supposed to do it here in Colorado is we're basically supposed to shred our product and then mix it with at least 50% post-consumer products. And I think that's a great way to go, because any dumpster diver that's going to get in a dumpster and go through some shredded fan leaves that's mixed with a bunch of trash. First of all, there's really most of the stuff we're tossing out has very little, if any, active ingredient in it, and at the same time, mixing it with post-consumer trash is a great way to go.
Well, and that's, I think that's another thing that we'll benefit from is moving to greenhouse is composting, which most people don't want to do inside. And when you're in a warehouse in Denver, you can't exactly set up a compost pile in the alleyway. So, but we're going to go to break and we'll come back and talk about more ideas for, I guess, green home growing.
The chocolatiers at Incredibles are dedicated to crafting the finest chocolate from high-quality ingredients to ensure the greatest possible medicated edibles in the world. Consistency and quality are top priority. Lab testing on each and every batch. Rick and Josh have been making non-medicated chocolates for years for such retail outlets as Whole Foods and Vitamin Cottage. Today, we are focused on crafting our award-winning medicated Incredible chocolate bars. We are professional bakers, and we believe food should be made from scratch. We guarantee your satisfaction. Have an incredible day.
iVita Wellness is committed to compassionate patient care while providing the highest quality medicine at an affordable price. At iVita Wellness, patients can get top-shelf ounces for $150 every day. iVita Wellness also carries pharmaceutical-grade pure CO2 oil. iVita Wellness is located in Uptown Denver on 1616 Pearl Street, open 7 days a week from 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. You can reach us at 303-952-9150 or our website at www.ivitawellness.com. iVita Wellness is Denver's Compassionate Care Center.
This segment was brought to you by The Farm, a medical marijuana care center located at 2801 Iris Street in Boulder. The Farm carries premium cannabis, edibles, and Hummingbird brand products. Visit our new cannabis lifestyle store for your local artesian glass, vaporizers, and hemp clothing. The Farm has been serving Boulder since 2009. Isn't it time you come and see what we have to offer?
And we're back. I wanted to ask you a little bit more, kind of off the topic of pesticide, but just for people who, now 64, you don't have to be a patient to grow, and there may be people who are experimenting at home for the first time. And what would you suggest they do at home for pest control? Because I think a lot of times it takes some experience to recognize the signs. So what should they be doing off the bat? And then what are the major signs to start looking for? Because, like, there's aphids, which you can see, but then there's root aphids, which you can't generally find. Spider mites are hard to find. So
I'll try not to be too long-winded because we could go on forever about this.
That's okay.
But one thing I would recommend to all growers is a new acronym that's sort of becoming popular in the green industry. And when I say green industry, I mean our industry at large, greenhouse growers, nursery growers, field production growers, is ICM, which is integrated crop management, which is really more important than integrated pest management. So basically, integrated crop management is talking about looking at all the factors that make your crop healthy and grow, because we all know a healthy crop is less likely to disease and bug pressure. So basically, integrated crop management It includes IPM, Integrated Pest Management, so that you do have a scheduled routine for how you are scouting for these bugs, making sure you do have low pressure or no pressure. But it also includes things like soil management, social management, and environmental management. And these are all things that we as growers want to look at on our plants to make sure they're healthy. So I'll just give you a quick example of each. Again, IPM, scout for pests, do things like that, have a record-keeping schedule. So if you know when you find pests, you know where ground zero is, you document that. You either quarantine it, get it out of the building, whatnot, things of that nature. Let's see, soil management. How healthy is our soil that we're growing in? Because oxygen content, that's one of the biggies that a lot of growers forget about. We're all trying to put a lot of nutrients on our plants and make them be as big and happy as they possibly can be, but we need to make sure that we have really good conditioned soils. And when I say conditioned, I mean a high oxygen ratio, especially for cannabis. Cannabis loves a lot of oxygen in the soil. If it can't breathe, it can't grow. So soil management, I would recommend take a look at your soils. Do they have a lot of organics already in them? Because if they do, that stuff's going to break down and become more compacted over time. So if your roots become soggy and wet, then you're more likely to have Pythium disease and things like that pop up. And with those disease pressures...
What's Pythium disease?
Pythium is a root rot, basically. So if you have an unhealthy root system or a root system that's not getting enough oxygen, it will eventually start to soften and rot the tissue of the plant. It'll get a disease called Pythium. There are a couple other different root diseases the plants are prone to get. But again, if you make sure you're not overwatering the plants. When you harvest your plants, checking the soil, or whether you're in a hydroponic system, check the root system. Check that stuff to make sure you are getting good oxygen levels. Because if you're not, then diseases are going to pop up. And when the diseases pop up, you're more prone to the pests as well. So in unhealthy grows, it's oftentimes very common. I'm a partner in Denver Relief Consulting as well, which is a pretty big consulting company. As you know, Jill, you work with us. Oftentimes when I go into a grow facility and do a site tour, it's not usually just one bug. It's either multiple bugs or it's bugs and diseases, because again, the plants weaken. If they have disease on them, then they're more prone to pest outbreaks as well. So soil management, make sure you have happy, healthy soils, and you'll have happy, healthy roots, and your plants will be big, strong plants, and they'll be better to fight off pests and disease. Social management is another one I mentioned. Social management is, make sure you have a standard operating procedure for your employees in the facility. Make sure, if you don't have people changing clothes when they're coming in, make sure they take a shower at least before they come in. Make sure they come directly into your facility. At least make them change their shoes in your facility. Things like that. So if we keep it clean socially in the facility, we're going to be more likely to limit our risk and our exposure. And then environmental, which is basically temperature, humidity. I always like to tell my employees THC. One of the first things you need to look at when you get in the room is THC. It's an easy acronym to remember for people in our industry, but THC to me is temperature, humidity, and CO2. First thing when I go into our rooms is what's the temperature, what's the humidity, and what's the CO2. One of the things that Integrated Pest Management, or IPM, talks about is the plant pest triangle, basically. You need so let's say you have a pest in your facility, but you actually need two more things to keep that pest in your facility. You need a host plant that the pest likes. We probably have that, cannabis, but you also need the environment for that pest. If the pest likes a high humidity and you knock the humidity out, then the reproduction's going to slow, and oftentimes the pest will actually crawl under the door or fly out a window and go look for some easier prey. So keeping the environmental controls in check to keep the plants happy and the bad bugs unhappy is very important. Temperature, humidity, CO2.
So do certain pests like certain strains better? And you'll find like different colonies of pests being attracted to different plants?
Absolutely. There are different pests and diseases that some strains are more susceptible than others.
And so what would you think the most common pests and diseases someone will see in a home grow are versus a commercial?
Pests would be spider mites. Out here in Colorado, root aphids have been pretty popular, quote unquote, the last couple years. But really, thrips and spider mites for cannabis is probably the biggest one that we see out here. Both of them are relatively easy to get rid of on the grand scheme of things. There's a organic bacteria called spinosad, which is really good for getting rid of thrips. The spider mites are something that you do. Spider mites are harder than thrips for sure. You definitely want to catch them at lower population levels. Out here we have the benefit that we can use some different miticides and things like that in the vegetation stage to help us get rid of those things. But there are also, if you catch spider mites and some of those things at low enough populations, then you can either remove some plants or use some of these OMRI-listed organic products on them as well to help get rid of them. As far as disease pressure, probably powdery mildew and botrytis mold or bud mold are the two most common. Powdery mildew is very easy to keep in check as long as you're on top of your environmental controls. If you have sufficient lighting in your room and good airflow, you're probably not going to get powdery mildew. It takes a really pretty big swing in humidity as well. It takes almost 20% swing in humidity in a relatively short period of time for powdery mildew to pop up. Lots of times when we see powdery mildew pop up, it's because a grower has all of his healthy, happy, younger plants under high-intensity light, but then in the corner of his room, he's got this old mother that she's already more susceptible because she's stressed out, she's old, she needs more space for her root system, and she doesn't have as much light or air flow around that plant if it's way off in the corner of your room and it's just getting a little bit of ambient light from whatever lights you have hanging in the middle of the room. So for the powdery mildew, if you keep really good airflow and good light intensity on your plants, it's hard to get it or have much of a problem with it, especially in a dry environment like we have here in Colorado. The bud mold's a little bit more difficult. It usually pops up late in flower. Bud mold happens basically because as the buds get really large and dense, they're 80-90% water weight, and they're trying to transpire a lot of that moisture from the interior of the bud. And lots of times they just can't do it quick enough if the humidity in the room is very high. So what our goal throughout most of flower is to shoot for a 45% humidity, but especially the last 2 or 3 weeks before harvest, it is absolutely essential to not go over 50% humidity, because if you do, you're going to turn the corner and find bud mold in some of your buds, and that's the last thing that you want to see.
So that's probably where most home growers have the hardest time, though, is that environmental control.
Environmental control. I did, when I first started growing myself, as a hobby grower, lots of times you don't have the time and energy to put into it, as much time or energy as you would like anyway, so you try to get by with the bare minimum. And lots of times when you try to get by with the bare minimum, you let your environmental control slip, you let your humidity go too high, too low. Same way with the temperature, you can either let it get too high, too low, and that's where a lot of these pressures pop up. So back to THC, if you keep your environmental controls in check, you're typically going to have happy plants, and lots of times happy plants will do all the fighting for you.
And so is it, earlier you were talking about powdery mildew, so I thought, and if I'm wrong, let me know, but powdery mildew could be in a plant and never pop up because the conditions
Absolutely.
are never ripe. So
before we moved to our current facility down here in Denver, which has been over 2.5 years now, quite a few of the strains and genetics that we have in the building had powdery mildew. Spores outbreaking and growth. We were in a different environment before our transition, and we had some issue where we did have, it was because of our hygiene. In our veg room, we did have some moms that were neglected, tossed off in the corner, and had those proper conditions for it to outbreak. But with that being said, we contain all those same genetics in our warehouse down here in town, and we've been in it for about 2.5 years now, and not once, knock on wood here, not once have I seen a powdery mildew spore in our facility down here. But again, all of the cuttings from our genetics were taken off of plants that at one point, several years back, had quite a bit of powdery mildew. Right. So it is in their DNA right now, and if we allow the environment to be correct for it, it will show itself immediately. But again, we've been on top of our environmental control, and because of that, we haven't had it.
That's interesting. And then I wonder, is it going to be harder to control those airborne spores in a greenhouse environment, you think? Or are you going to have all the same capacity to filter the air as you do indoors?
There are some pretty high-tech greenhouses these days. and yes, you do have the same. It's really no different. Most indoor growers are pulling in some air and exhausting some air to one extent or the other, whether it's in their open space, maybe not directly into their grow rooms. But for the most part, we all have air leaking into our warehouse facilities. I've yet to be in a warehouse facility that is completely airproof or airtight right now. So yeah, with greenhouses, you have just as good of environmental control, and you can put screens on your evaporative coolers, nets, and things like that, and have carbon filters and all of those good things that do help keep the bugs out.
So, what products are probably like easiest to use for the beginning grower, as far as, we'll call them pesticides because they are, even though they might be perfectly safe. Like you'd mentioned spinosad, like what would you say the top preventative things are? And you had mentioned neem. Mm-hmm. So what else should people be using on a pretty regular basis versus if they see an infestation, let's just say spider mites, then what should they move to?
Okay. In the beginning, foliar sprays will help as well in vegetation. We use one that has some sulfur content in it, and most bugs do not like sulfur concentrations. It changes the pH on the leaf of the plant, but it's also a little bit toxic to them. So most bugs don't like sulfur. So if you can find some kind of foliar spray, lots of times the foliar sprays are high in nitrogen. If you can find a foliar spray that does have a little bit of sulfur in it, that will help. And the foliar sprays in general help a lot in vegetation as well, because they make sort of a waxy layer on top of your plant and help make that cuticle a little bit tougher. At the same time, I recommend 24 to 48 hours after you put any foliar spray or any kind of pesticide on your plants, go back and do a rinse and spray those down, because in an indoor environment, the stomates or the stomata, the openings, the pores on the leaf of the plant, we don't want to clog those up too much, because that's where the CO2 is being pulled into the plant and making photosynthesis happen. So if we clog up all the pores on the plant surface, not only can it not transpire and act like a water pump and pull water up through the root system, but it also can't take in CO2 through those pores. So it's very important to rinse the plant and not continually week after week put foliar sprays on it without considering the pores on the plant leaf.
All right, well, let's go ahead and go to break, and when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about pesticides.
Canapunch is a delicious and effective medical marijuana beverage proudly made right here in Colorado. Each bottle is freshly infused with 100% pure flower extract from the highest grade marijuana plants available today. Using proprietary extraction methods, every bottle of Canapunch is consistently and reliably infused with an exact milligram dosage that you can count on to relieve your symptoms each and every time. Canapunch is delicious. There's never any medicine-y taste. We use only 100% cannabis flowers. No trim or byproducts are ever used in Canapunch. It does not require refrigeration and comes in convenient, resealable multi-dose bottles from 60 milligrams to 200 milligrams. We have drinks with dosage that works best for you. Canapunch is available in a variety of delicious flavors like black cherry, watermelon, pineapple mango, and blue raspberry. And we now have strain-specific beverages available just for you. Canapunch is delicious, convenient, consistent, and effective. Give it a try and experience the Canapunch difference. InDispensary in Colorado Springs is proud to support Overgrow the Radio. With 2 locations in Colorado Springs, InDispensary invites you to discover what true selection and values feel like. Always featuring an incredible array of Stanley Brothers medicine as well as full line of edible and infused products. InDispensary is open from 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. 7 days a week, 364 days a year. You owe it to your health and well-being to discover InDispensary. Westside location at 3044 West Colorado and Eastside location at 3031 East Platte in Colorado Springs. InDispensary is your destination for indispensable quality medicine.
I'm Gary Johnson, and you're listening to iCannabis Radio, and I want to say, talk it up, Colorado.
Welcome back. So for home growers, often, so we talked a little bit about prevention, but if you could talk a little bit more, because they're getting genetics from each other. So, and I've heard so many times, I brought clones from so-and-so over, and now my whole room is infested. So how can you prevent that from happening as someone who doesn't have as much experience? Like, what are you looking for to know whether or not you should bring something into your room?
A good visual inspection is a really good first start, and I don't mean just with your naked eye. Take a magnifying glass, at least 20 times magnification, and really look over the plant thoroughly, because a lot of plants, unfortunately, do have something on them, one pest or disease or another on them when you're doing those transactions and trading plants or however you're getting them. It's just it's a fact of agriculture. It's lots of times there are bugs and diseases that like our plants, and no matter how hard we try, sooner or later they are going to pop up. What I would recommend is initially quarantine whatever you're taking, whether it's got anything or not. Go ahead and hit it with a few synthetics, especially in a state like Colorado where we're allowed to. Hit it with a miticide, maybe hit it with a couple other synthetics. Do that to the initial mother plant or cutting that you get in, and then grow it out for quite some time. Take cuttings off of that plant, because by the time you take cuttings off that plant, by the time you veg those plants out and get those plants to flower, the residual from those synthetics is going to be long gone from the plant. With that being said, systemic is a big keyword that you try to stay away from most of the time. There are a lot of miticides out there that are not systemic. When I say systemic, most of you out there probably know what I mean. Anything that the plant actually takes into its vascular system and holds basically in its vascular system. There are a lot of miticides and things like that out there that are translaminar, meaning that they do soak through the leaf. Whether you get 100% coverage spraying the top and bottom of the leaf, they do go into the leaf to a certain extent and help kill off the bugs. But they're not systemic in the fact that they don't stay in the vascular system of the plant for 30, 45, 60, 90 days. A lot of these systemic synthetics can stay in the plant for 60, 90, 100 days. And we have a short cycle crop here, so we really can't be playing around too much with these systemics. But again, at the same time, you can use these synthetics. Use them on your mother plants when you bring them in like that. Quarantine them and use it on those plants, and grow those plants out. Grow it for a few generations if you have the opportunity to. You can take that cutting in, you can hit it really hard with synthetics, keep it in a small closet or a room quarantined from everything that you have, keep it there for a week or two, hit it with multiple applications, try to keep it healthy. Bring it into your veg room once you've had enough quarantine time on it. And at that point, again, you can grow the mom out for a couple months. You could take cuttings off of cuttings. So essentially you could, let's say you're worried about that plant having just a little bit of residual. Take a cutting off of it, pot that cutting up, and then take more cuttings off of that cutting. Make that second cutting be your mother plant. End up tossing the initial plant that you took in. Keep it there until you can get enough cuttings off of it. Toss that plant out. Now any residual that may be left in that plant is gone. And as you get 2-3 generations of cuttings into these plants, then you can assure yourself that you're not accidentally consuming something that could be potentially carcinogenic.
So how do you know? Well, and you mentioned carcinogenic, so let me get off topic for a little bit. But one thing I had always thought was safe and that a lot of growers were using a while ago was pyrethrum. And then I had met a master horticulturist and professor at CSU who said, but when consumed or inhaled, combusted, pyrethrum is carcinogenic. So that's an example of a perfectly organic material not being applicable to this crop. So how do you, A, know how long something's going to last on your plant, and B, know if, even though it's organic, that it's not something you should be using?
Do your homework. There are a lot of good resources out there. Whatever product you decide to use, go to multiple different sources and research that product, because some of the sources might be contradictory, and you really want to be pretty confident in the product you're using and know if it's got carcinogens in it and things like that. Pyrethrum is something that we actually use to bomb our rooms when we're sanitizing them or cleaning them. We never set off a pyrethrum bomb when plants are in the room. But at the same time, we like to start off with clean rooms. So what we'll do is we have basically a 24 to 48 hour period when we're from harvest, when we're transitioning to our new flower room. And what we'll do is we'll use, that's when you can pull out some pretty gnarly stuff and use some pretty heavy synthetics. Again, the pyrethrum is actually organic. It comes from chrysanthemums, but it can be still pretty toxic to the plant as well. That's one of the main reasons we don't use it, is because it can have a negative effect to the health of the plant, which can obviously cause other problems. But again, we will definitely use those when we're flipping the room. So we'll get all the plant material out, make sure there's nothing in there, seal the room down, let off a bomb or two. Make sure you're starting with a fresh room when you get your plants into flowers, so that if there are any critters hiding in the corners or any larvae or eggs laying around, that you make sure you neutralize those immediately.
Well, and what about reusing pots and cleaning your pots between? What do you guys use to?
We actually use Simple Green. Something that's really common is 1 part chlorine bleach or any type of chlorine, basically. One part of bleach to 9 parts water. You got to be really careful with bleach and make sure that you rinse everything out really well so that you don't have negative effects on the plants, because bleach can be very toxic. It can even be bleach vapor in the air can even be toxic because it can be absorbed through the pores of the plant, and if it's in high enough concentration, it can burn the plant that way. We actually oftentimes use Simple Green. It's an organic product. It works really well for us. We use all fabric pots in our facility now, I'm happy to say, and they work great. But we basically do a scrub wash in a tub with Simple Green and our fabric pots. Same thing we do for all of our flood tables as well. We flood most of our crops, and we actually don't even use anything as harsh as bleach. We just try to keep things clean to begin with, and then when we're flipping the crop over, we will scrub them down with some Simple Green and start fresh.
Well, it's funny, house I'm living in now. I went to go, just got into the house. I filled up. It had a nice jetted tub in the master bedroom, and I fill up the tub, and I'm so excited, and I hit start on the jets, and perlite and dirt starts flying out of the jetted tub. I'm like, this guy was cleaning his pots in the jetted tub. He must not have been married for sure. Yeah. But I was like, oh, that's interesting.
The jets helped, I'm sure. Yeah,
I'm sure it did.
Well worth it to him.
I have never been able to get it clean, ever. Like, I just gave up on ever using that tub because every time you turn it on, it spits out perlite and dirt. Like, no matter how many times I've run it, drained it, it will forever be in that tub.
Real estate in Colorado, huh?
Exactly.
That's funny.
When you go looking for houses, you can tell where there's been grow rooms for sure.
Yeah.
And some of them are not that sanitary. So when you talk about environmental control, and I think about like some of the home grows I've seen, they're not well controlled. And so what would you say is most important for healthy plants? When someone is like in their basement or they're outside in a shed and they have, is it better to have some bugs, or is it better to bomb the crud out of it?
Sure. Population density is definitely something that you want to take into consideration. If you have low enough populations, depending on the bug, you might not want to do anything with it. Fungus gnats, for example, are something that are nearly impossible to get rid of, whether you're in a large scale or a small scale facility. But fungus gnats really, they eat a little bit of fungus maybe off the top of your pot or media, but they really don't put a whole lot of pressure on the plant or affect the plant in any way. So there are some pests like that where if it's a low enough population, you could probably do some mechanical things or just do some cleanliness and tidy up the grow a little bit and help lower those populations. At the same time, there are some other bugs that are pretty nasty little critters that you definitely, as soon as you see them, you want to take some immediate actions to get rid of them. And with that being said, lots of times as far as environmental control goes in a smaller indoor grow, lots of times growers, they know what temperature they're supposed to be at. They know they need a light hanging over the plants. Two of the things that we see most commonly, especially in small residential grows, is airflow. If the plants don't have enough airflow, then they're not getting good CO2 to the plant, and therefore photosynthesis comes to a crawl, basically. And also humidity. Lots of times we'll see really low humidity, especially like here in Colorado, because our outdoor humidity is so low. But once your humidity in your grow room goes under 35%, the plant's DNA basically tells it to close up all those skin pores essentially on it, and it closes those up because the plant's acting as a water pump. If it starts pulling up water and transpiring more quickly than it can replenish it with the root system, it knows it's going to dry out. So when you drop to humidities lower than 35%, the plant goes, oh, wait a minute here, we're going to dry out. So instead of drying out, let's close up all our stomata and let's quit pulling up water. And again, photosynthesis stops, the plant becomes unhealthy all of a sudden, the light starts to burn it more easily, and it just keeps compounding problems.
Well, and real quick, I only have a couple of minutes left, but I wanted to ask you, when we talk about home grow and safety and CO2, have you seen the bags that are like organic material? They look like rot, but they slow release CO2. Would you recommend that for a home grow over trying to get a tank?
I probably would. CO2's got to be at extremely high levels to even make you dizzy. So those bags are definitely not going to get to high enough concentrations to make anybody pass out or anything like that. So I absolutely would. Lots of times, tanks become cumbersome to drag in and out of the house every week and things like that. So, and with that being said, lots of times just having good airflow. Maybe just put an intake fan on the basement window, pull some air in from outside. You don't necessarily have to supplement with CO2 as long as you are pulling air in from outside and exhausting. So a small intake fan, a small exhaust fan, bring it in from under the porch or through a basement window or something like that. Outside CO2 is about 400 parts per million. The plants like it if we can crank it up to 1,000 or 1,500 parts per million. But if you're a small grower, hobby grower, you really don't have to have it. But those bags are a great option for smaller growers.
So we only have a couple of minutes left. So back to the cup. You guys entered one strain or more than one?
We just entered one strain, OG18, in the hybrid category. It's actually a cut that I got off of a good friend of mine about probably 9 to 12 months ago now, I guess. It's a phenomenal OG cut. It's originally one of DNA Genetics' OG phenotypes that they ended up getting in some of their breeding projects. But it's a really solid OG cut, and I think it's got a pretty good chance.
Awesome. Well, good luck. And
Thank you.
I want to thank our sponsors. And if you're coming out to the cup, please stop by the iCannabis table. I have no idea where we're going to be. Do you know? Just find us, come say hi, and stop by and see the sponsors and tell them thank you for sponsoring. Our sponsors are Dixie, Elixirs, Greenworks, Canna Punch, Indispensary, iVita, Cannassure, The Clinic, The Farm, Incredibles, and Blue Sage Microbes. So have a awesome 420 weekend. Do not drive. Just get a ride. It's just easier. And we don't, they're hearing DUID on Monday at 1:30, the Senate Judiciary Committee. So if you have time, email your senator, your state senator. You can put in your zip code and figure out who that is and tell them to vote no against DUID. But let's not give them any reason to have some fodder on Monday to talk about. So take the light rail, and hopefully we'll see you there.
Thanks for having me, Jill.
Thank you so much, Nick, for coming. And Jennifer will be back next week. So that's exciting. I have no idea what we're going to talk about. We'll probably talk about the cup and all the testing she did for it. She did 175 samples this weekend. So OG18 being one of them, I'm sure. So we will just talk about that next week. Everybody have a great week and try to get some sleep in between all these events. Talk to you next week. Thanks.